Read by Brian Troxel.
Forward by James K. Galbraith. Toward the end of this account, my father brought himself, with a show of reluctance that he knew would not be taken too seriously, to comment on whether another crash would come. There were many reasons, including memory and new regulation, why not. But then, no one can doubt that the American people remain susceptible to the speculative mood, to the conviction that enterprise can be attended by unlimited rewards in which they, individually, were meant to share. A rising market can still bring the reality of riches. This, in turn, can draw more and more people to participate. The government preventatives and controls are ready. In the hands of a determined government, their efficacy cannot be doubted. There are, however, 100 reasons why a government will determine not to use them. The main relevance of the Great Crash, 1929, to the Great Crisis of 2008 is surely here. In both cases, the government knew what it should do. Both times, it declined to do it. In the summer of 1929, a few stern words from on high, a rise in the discount rate, a tough investigation into the pyramid schemes of the day, and the house of cards on Wall Street would have tumbled before its fall destroyed the whole economy. In 2004, the FBI warned publicly of an epidemic of mortgage fraud. But the government did nothing, and less than nothing, delivering instead low interest rates, deregulation, and clear signals that laws would not be enforced. This was fuel for fires. The Greenspan doctrine held that bubbles cannot be prevented, that the government's task is merely to clean up afterward. The Greenspan practice was to create one bubble after another, until finally one came along so vast that it destroyed the system on the way by. At its source, our crisis is a housing crisis, and not one of too little housing, but of too much. It springs from a predatory attack on the safeguards that had for decades kept housing finance safe and stable. In the early 2000s, the Bush administration sent clear signals that regulations on mortgages would not be enforced. The signals were not subtle. On one occasion, the director of the Office of Thrift Supervision came to a press conference with copies of the Federal Register and a chainsaw. There followed every manner of scheme to fleece the unsuspecting. Liar's loans, no-doc loans, and neutron loans were terms of art in the business. Bundled together, rated and securitized, then spread through the world and left to fester until rising interest rates and crashing prices wrecked the system. Richard Cohen of the Washington Post penned a memorable account of one case, a Maravine Halterman of Avondale, Arizona. At age 61, after 13 years of uninterrupted unemployment and at least as many years of living on welfare, she got a mortgage. She got it even though at one time she had 23 people living in the house, 576 square feet, one bath, and some ramshackle outbuildings. She got it for $103,000, an amount that far exceeded the value of the house. The place has since been condemned. Halterman's house was never exactly a showcase. The city had since cited her for all the junk, clothes, tires, etc., on her lawn. Nonetheless, a local financial institution with the cover your wallet name of Integrity Funding LLC gave her a mortgage, valuing the house at about twice what a nearby and comparable property sold for. Integrity Funding then sold the loan to Wells Fargo and Company, which sold it to HSBC Holdings plc, which then packaged it with thousands of other risky mortgages and offered the indigestible porridge to investors. Standard & Poor's and Moody's Investors Service took a look at it all, as they are supposed to do, and pronounced it AAA. This was fraud, perpetrated in the first instance by the government on the population, and by the rich on the poor. The borrowers were, of course, complicit in some cases, taking out mortgages they never had a hope of paying down. In many more, they were simply naive, gullible, open to pressure, credulous, and hopeful. Something might turn up. They took the assurances of lenders that housing prices always rise, that bad loans can always be refinanced. They were attractive to lenders for all of these reasons, and because they had nothing to lose. A borrower with nothing to lose will sign papers that another will not. A government that permits this to happen is complicit in a vast crime. As in 1929, the architects of disaster will form a rich rogues gallery to go shooting in. The old objectivist, Alan Greenspan, was intermittently aware of impending disaster and resolutely unwilling to stop it. The Liberals banker, Robert Rubin, had a reputation for fiscal probity eclipsed by catastrophic complacency at Citigroup, where he was paid $115 million and maintained silence, so far as we know. There will be Phil Gramm, of whom in April 2008, The Washington Post wrote that he was the sorcerer's apprentice of financial instability and disaster. The Post was quoting me. Reached on the phone, Gramm denied it. There will be Lawrence Summers, impassioned advocate of the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, bounced from Harvard's presidency to Obama's White House. A man whose reputation remains to be rebuilt or buried by events. And Bernard Madoff. The wreckage of bloated reputations is part of the fun of a crash, at least in deep retrospect. And in the renewed prosperity of the 1950s and later years, my father and history were generally content to leave matters there. Of the figures here told of, Charles Mitchell and Samuel Insull were acquitted, Ivar Kruger committed suicide, and only Richard Whitney entered Sing Sing. Juries in our time, if they get the chance, will be less forgiving. Whether they will get the chance is another matter. If they don't, there is not much hope to clean up after the colossal crimes of the past decade. And so far, if the Obama presidency harbors the Roosevelt who gave us the Emergency Banking Act and the SEC, he has not yet come into the open. But there is time, and we shall see. Largely missing from a book on the Great Crisis 2008 will be the elements of hope, credulity, and carefree optimism that were redeeming features of the 1920s boom. It made people very happy at the time. We read in these pages Frederick Lewis Allen's account of the rich man's chauffeur, his ears laid back for news of a movement in Bethlehem steel, and the Wyoming cattleman who traded 1,000 shares a day. In 1929, millions thought they could easily become rich, and some did. The parallel moment in modern history came in the late 1990s, in the information technology boom under President Clinton, which dissolved at the turn of the decade. The years after Bush v. Gore, the years of 9/11, the War on Terror, and the invasion of Iraq, had no element of this. The masseuse who put her life savings into Madoff's hands wasn't trying to get rich. She was hoping only for a safe and steady return. Millions of others, who took out mortgages, were asking for even less. They were not, in the main, speculators. What they wanted, most of all, was just what everyone else already had, a home of their own. The trouble for them was, there was no way to get one without making a speculative bet. Now they are losing their homes by the millions. An American tragedy, as families double up, move to rentals, crowd into motel rooms or their cars, or spill out into city parks. The victims of the bust extend across the American middle class, to millions of prime credits with half-paid loans and 401k plans and a little cash, whose home equity, stock holdings, and interest earnings all collapsed. What in 1930 took the dramatic form of runs on the bank, the wiping out of middle-class savings and wealth, in 2008 and 2009 took the form of a simultaneous month-over-month collapse in asset values, followed by the bankruptcy, downsizing, and liquidation of business firms. In this, there was often less immediate hardship, the country is not short of food, than the drying up of possibilities for college, work, and retirement. This, too, casts a pall over our time. Just as the years before the recent crisis were not joyful, the world after it risks being less acutely desperate and more merely dreary than the age of Roosevelt and the New Deal. Whether the events following the crisis will track the disasters of 1930 and later years is also doubtful. In our day of big government, with what economists call automatic stabilizers and immediate fiscal stimulus, slumps are milder and recoveries come sooner than was the case almost a century back. It took 4 years for the United States to turn to Roosevelt, while by an accident of political timing, it was able to elect and install Barack Obama within just a few months. Correspondingly, the situation facing the country today is less dire. The consensus behind radical action is weaker, and the instincts of the administration are less heroic. As this is written, the broad economy seems to have stabilized, and experts are debating whether the stock revival of early 2009 is the start of recovery or a sucker's rally. Production may resume, but with an ever larger share coming from imports. Yet things could still go very wrong. The administration seems determined to keep every toxic bank and insurance company alive and intact. No one expects an early revival of employment, and no plans are afoot that would quickly re-employ the millions who are losing their jobs. The Great Crisis has so far not produced its Harry Hopkins, Harold Ickes, Francis Perkins, Henry Wallace, and the others, whose eventual emergence is implicit here. For all these reasons, it seems altogether unlikely that the books to come on the Great Crisis of 2008 will be as much fun as this one. A final word. Readers of The Great Crash 1929 may have wondered about the investing habits of its author, and in particular whether, like Keynes, he was ever tempted by the sirens of financial speculation. I can report that, so far as I know, he was not. His portfolio was that of a value investor, a buy and holder for a retirement he never actually took, as he rode on, happily and profitably, practically until his death, at 97, in April 2006. He was also not averse, on occasion, to even stricter precaution. I remember calling him on the night of the market break in October 1987, an event that brought this book back from a brief disappearance. It was, due to the attentions of the national press, somewhat difficult to get through on the phone. But when I did, I heard the reassuring paternal voice. "James, is that you?" Pause. "Not to worry, I've been in cash for 3 weeks." But then there was another pause, and the tone changed. "But I'm sorry to say, the same cannot be said of your mother. She finds it very difficult to sell the General Electric that her family bought from Edison for $1. Austin, Texas, May 18, 2009. Introduction. The View from the 90s. The Great Crash 1929 was first published in 1955 and has been continuously in print ever since, a matter now of 40 years and more. Authors, and publishers being as they are, the tendency is to attribute this endurance to the excellence of the work. Evidently, this book has some merit, but, for worse or perhaps better, there is another reason for its durability. Each time it has been about to pass from print and the bookstores, another speculative episode, another bubble or the ensuing misfortune, has stirred interest in the history of this, the great modern case of boom and collapse, which led on to an unforgiving depression. One of the subsequent episodes occurred, in fact, as the book was coming from the printer. There was a small stock market boom in the spring of 1955. I was called to Washington to testify at a Senate hearing on the past experience. During my testimony that morning, the stock market went suddenly south. I was blamed for the collapse, especially by those who were long in the market. A fair number of the latter wrote to threaten me with physical injury. A more devout citizenry told me they were praying for my ill health or early demise. A few days after my testimony, I broke my leg while skiing in Vermont. The papers carried mention. Letters came in telling me of prayers that had been answered. I had at least done something for religion. In the mood of the times, a senator from Indiana, Homer E. Capehart, said it was the work of a crypto-communist. That was only the beginning. The offshore funds insanity of the 70s, the big bust of 1987, less dramatic episodes or fears, all brought attention back to 1929 and kept the book in print, and so again now in 1997. That we are having a major speculative splurge as this is written is obvious to anyone not captured by vacuous optimism. There is now far more money flowing into the stock markets than there is intelligence to guide it. There are many more mutual funds than there are financially acute, historically aware men and women to manage them. I am not given to prediction. One's foresight is forgotten, only one's errors are well remembered. But there is here a basic and recurrent process. It comes with rising prices, whether of stocks, real estate, works of art, or anything else. This increase attracts attention and buyers, which produces the further effect of even higher prices. Expectations are thus justified by the very action that sends prices up. The process continues. Optimism with its market effect is the order of the day. Prices go up even more. Then, for reasons that will endlessly be debated, comes the end. The descent is always more sudden than the increase. A balloon that has been punctured does not deflate in an orderly way. To repeat, I make no prediction. I only observe that this phenomenon has manifested itself many times since 1637, when Dutch speculators saw tulip bulbs as their magic road to wealth, and 1720, when John Law brought presumptive wealth and then sudden poverty to Paris through the pursuit of gold, to this day undiscovered in Louisiana. In these years also the great South Sea bubble spread financial devastation in Britain. Later there was more. In the United States in the 19th century, there was a speculative splurge every 20 or 30 years. This was already a tradition, for the colonies, North and South, had experimented at no slight eventual cost with currency issues that had no visible backing. They did well until it was observed that there was nothing there. The revolution was paid for with continental notes, giving permanence to the phrase, "not worth a continental." In the years following the War of 1812 to 1814, there was a major real estate boom. In the 1830s came wild speculation in canal and turnpike investment. Internal improvements, they were termed. Along with this went issues of banknotes unbacked by anything of value, and issued by anyone able to hire a building larger than that of the local blacksmith. This came powerfully to an end in 1837. In the 1850s came another boom and collapse. And in those years, a New England bank, in a part of the country more cautious than most, closed down. It had $500,000 in notes outstanding and assets to cover them of $86.48. After the Civil War came the railroad boom, and a particularly painful collapse in 1873. Another boom came to an equally dramatic end in 1907. But the big New York banks were able, this time, to limit the damage. Earlier, a considerable flow of British funds had fueled the American speculation, notably that just mentioned in railroads. There was also a renewed British involvement in South America, the South Sea bubble now forgotten. The greatly distinguished Baring brothers had to be rescued by the Bank of England from bankruptcy, occasioned by its loans to Argentina. This is currently interesting, for in the 1990s, Barings was caught up in the more or less incredible operations of one of its minor minions in Singapore. This time, there was no rescue. Barings, for all public purposes, disappeared. If we do now have a downturn, what is called a day of reckoning, some things can indeed be foreseen. By some estimates, a quarter of all Americans, directly or indirectly, are in the stock market. Were there a bad slump, it would limit their expenditures, especially of durable goods, and put pressure on their very large credit card debt. The result would be a generally adverse effect on the economy. This would not be as painful as the after effects of 1929. Then, banks were fragile and without deposit insurance. Farm markets were important and especially vulnerable. There was no cushioning effect from unemployment compensation, welfare payments, and Social Security. All this is better now. But there could be a recession. That would be normal. There would also be, we may be certain, the traditional reassuring words from Washington. Always, when markets are in trouble, the phrases are the same. The economic situation is fundamentally sound. Or simply, the fundamentals are good. All who hear these words should know that something is wrong. Once more, I do not predict and tell only what the past so vividly tells us. I offer a final word on this book. It was published in that spring of 1955 to an appreciative audience. There was a brief appearance on the bestseller lists. I looked with pleasure at the bookstore windows. On my frequent visits to New York, I was distressed, however, to see no sign of it in a small bookshop on the ramp leading down to the plains in the old LaGuardia terminal. One night, I stopped in to inspect the shelves. The lady in charge finally noticed me and asked what I sought. Somewhat embarrassed, I passed over the name of the author and said it was a work called The Great Crash. Not a book you could sell in an airport, she responded firmly. Chapter 1. Vision and Boundless Hope and Optimism. On December 4, 1928, President Coolidge sent his last message on the State of the Union to the reconvening Congress. Even the most melancholy congressman must have found reassurance in his words. No Congress of the United States ever assembled, on surveying the State of the Union, has met with a more pleasing prospect than that which appears at the present time. In the domestic field, there is tranquility and contentment, and the highest record of years of prosperity. In the foreign field, there is peace, the goodwill which comes from mutual understanding. He told the legislators that they and the country might regard the present with satisfaction and anticipate the future with optimism. And, breaking sharply with the most ancient of our political conventions, he omitted to attribute this well-being to the excellence of the administration which he headed. The main source of these unexampled blessings lies in the integrity and character of the American people. A whole generation of historians has assailed Coolidge for the superficial optimism, which kept him from seeing that a great storm was brewing at home and also more distantly abroad. This is grossly unfair. It requires neither courage nor prescience to predict disaster. Courage is required of the man who, when things are good, says so. Historians rejoice in crucifying the false prophet of the millennium. They never dwell on the mistake of the man who wrongly predicted Armageddon. There was much that was good about the world of which Coolidge spoke. True, as liberal misanthropes have insisted, the rich were getting richer much faster than the poor were getting less poor. The farmers were unhappy, and had been ever since the Depression of 1920 to 1921 had cut farm prices sharply but left costs high. Black people in the South and white people in the Southern Appalachians continued to dwell in hopeless poverty. Fine old English houses with high gables, leaded glass, and well-simulated half-timbering were rising in the country club district, while farther in town, one encountered the most noisome slums outside the Orient. All this notwithstanding, the 20s in America were a very good time. Production and employment were high and rising. Wages were not going up much, but prices were stable. Although many people were still very poor, more people were comfortably well off, well-to-do, or rich than ever before. Finally, American capitalism was undoubtedly in a lively phase. Between 1925 and 1929, the number of manufacturing establishments increased from 183,900 to 206,700. The value of their output rose from $60.8 billion to $68.0 billion. The Federal Reserve Index of Industrial Production, which had averaged only 67 in 1921, 1923 to 1925 equals 100, had risen to 110 by July 1928, and it reached 126 in June 1929. In 1926, 4,301,000 automobiles were produced. 3 years later, in 1929, production had increased by over 1 million to 5,358,000, a figure which compares very decently with the 5,700,000 new car registrations of the opulent year of 1953. Business earnings were rising rapidly, and it was a good time to be in business. Indeed, even the most jaundiced histories of the era concede, tacitly, that times were good, for they nearly all join in taxing Coolidge for his failure to see that they were too good to last. This notion of an iron law of compensation, the notion that the 10 good years of the 20s had to be paid for by the 10 bad ones of the 30s, is one to which it will be worthwhile to return. 2. One thing in the 20s should have been visible even to Coolidge. It concerned the American people, of whose character he had spoken so well. Along with the sterling qualities he praised, they were also displaying an inordinate desire to get rich quickly, with a minimum of physical effort. The first striking manifestation of this personality trait was in Florida. There, in the mid-20s, Miami, Miami Beach, Coral Gables, the East Coast as far north as Palm Beach, and the cities over on the Gulf had been struck by the great Florida real estate boom. The Florida boom contained all of the elements of the classic speculative bubble. There was the indispensable element of substance. Florida had a better winter climate than New York, Chicago, or Minneapolis. Higher incomes and better transportation were making it increasingly accessible to the frost-bound north. The time indeed was coming when the annual flight to the south would be as regular and impressive as the migrations of the Canada goose. On that indispensable element of fact, men and women had proceeded to build a world of speculative make-believe. This is a world inhabited not by people who have to be persuaded to believe, but by people who want an excuse to believe. In the case of Florida, they wanted to believe that the whole peninsula would soon be populated by the holiday makers and the sun worshippers of a new and remarkably indolent era. So great would be the crush that beaches, bogs, swamps, and common scrubland would all have value. The Florida climate obviously did not ensure that this would happen, but it did enable people who wanted to believe it would happen so to believe. However, speculation does not depend entirely on the capacity for self-delusion. In Florida, land was divided into building lots and sold for a 10% down payment. Palpably, much of the unlovely terrain that thus changed hands was as repugnant to the people who bought it as to the passerby. The buyers did not expect to live on it. It was not easy to suppose that anyone ever would. But these were academic considerations. The reality was that this dubious asset was gaining in value by the day and could be sold at a handsome profit in a fortnight. It is another feature of the speculative mood that, as time passes, the tendency to look beyond the simple fact of increasing values to the reasons on which it depends greatly diminishes. And there is no reason why anyone should do so, as long as the supply of people who buy, with the expectation of selling at a profit, continues to be augmented at a sufficiently rapid rate to keep prices rising. Through 1925, the pursuit of effortless riches brought people to Florida in satisfactorily increasing numbers. More land was subdivided each week. What was loosely called seashore became 5, 10, or 15 miles from the nearest brine. Suburbs became an astonishing distance from town. As the speculation spread northward, an enterprising Bostonian, Mr. Charles Ponzi, developed a subdivision near Jacksonville. It was approximately 65 miles west of the city. In other respects, Ponzi believed in good, compact neighborhoods. He sold 23 lots to the acre. In instances where the subdivision was close to town, as in the case of Manhattan Estates, which were not more than 3/4 of a mile from the prosperous and fast-growing city of Nettie, the city, as was so of Nettie, did not exist. The congestion of traffic into the state became so severe that in the autumn of 1925, the railroads were forced to proclaim an embargo on less essential freight, which included building materials for developing the subdivisions. Values rose wonderfully. Within 40 miles of Miami, inside lots sold at from $8,000 to $20,000. Waterfront lots brought from $15,000 to $25,000, and more or less bona fide seashore sites brought $20,000 to $75,000. However, in the spring of 1926, the supply of new buyers, so essential to the reality of increasing prices, began to fail. As 1928 and 1929 were to show, the momentum built up by a good boom is not dissipated in a moment. For a while in 1926, the increasing eloquence of the promoters offset the diminishing supply of prospects. Even the cathedral voice of William Jennings Bryan, which once had thundered against the cross of gold, had been for a time enlisted in the sorry task of selling swampland. But this boom was not left to collapse of its own weight. In the autumn of 1926, 2 hurricanes showed, in the words of Frederick Lewis Allen, what a soothing tropic wind could do when it got a running start from the West Indies. The worst of these winds, on September 18, 1926, killed 400 people, tore the roofs from thousands of houses, and piled tons of water and a number of elegant yachts into the streets of Miami. There was agreement that the storm had caused a healthy breathing spell in the boom, although its resumption was predicted daily. In the Wall Street Journal of October 8, 1926, one Peter O. Knight, an official of the Seaboard Airline and a sincere believer in the future of Florida, acknowledged that some 17 or 18,000 people were in need of assistance. But he added, "The same Florida is still there, with its magnificent resources, its wonderful climate, and its geographical position. It is the Riviera of America." He expressed concern that the solicitation of Red Cross funds for hurricane relief would do more damage permanently to Florida than would be offset by the funds received. This reluctance to concede that the end has come is also in accordance with the classic pattern. The end had come in Florida. In 1925, bank clearings in Miami were $1,066,528,000. By 1928, they were down to $143,364,000. Farmers who had sold their land at a handsome price and had condemned themselves as it later sold for double, treble, quadruple the original price, now on occasion got it back through a whole chain of subsequent defaults. Sometimes it was equipped with eloquently named streets, and with sidewalks, street lamps, and taxes and assessments amounting to several times its current value. The Florida boom was the first indication of the mood of the 20s, and the conviction that God intended the American middle class to be rich. But that this mood survived the Florida collapse is still more remarkable. It was widely understood that things had gone to pieces in Florida. While the number of speculators was almost certainly small compared with the subsequent participation in the stock market, nearly every community contained a man who was known to have taken quite a beating in Florida. For a century after the collapse of the South Sea bubble, Englishmen regarded the most reputable joint stock companies with some suspicion. Even as the Florida boom collapsed, the faith of Americans in quick, effortless enrichment in the stock market was becoming every day more evident. 3. It is hard to say when the stock market boom of the 1920s began. There were sound reasons why, during these years, the prices of common stocks should rise. Corporate earnings were good and growing. The prospect seemed benign. In the early 20s, stock prices were low and yields favorable. In the last 6 months of 1924, the prices of securities began to rise, and the increase was continued and extended through 1925. Thus, at the end of May 1924, the New York Times average of the prices of 25 industrial stocks was 106. By the end of the year, it was 134. By December 31, 1925, it had gained very nearly another 50 points and stood at 181. The advance through 1925 was remarkably steady. There were only a couple of months when values did not show a net gain. During 1926, there was something of a setback. Business was off a little in the early part of that year. It was thought by many that values the year before had risen unreasonably. February brought a sharp fall in the market, and March a rather abrupt collapse. The Times Industrials went down from 181 at the beginning of the year to 172 at the end of February, and then dropped by nearly 30 points to 143 at the end of March. However, in April, the market steadied and renewed its advance. Another mild setback occurred in October, just after the hurricane blew away the vestiges of the Florida boom, but again, recovery was prompt. At the end of the year, values were about where they had been at the beginning. In 1927, the increase began in earnest. Day after day and month after month, the price of stocks went up. The gains by later standards were not large, but they had an aspect of great reliability. Again, in only 2 months in 1927 did the averages fail to show an increase. On May 20th, when Lindbergh took off from Roosevelt Field and headed for Paris, a fair number of citizens were unaware of the event. The market, which that day was registering another of its small but solid gains, had by then acquired a faithful band of devotees who spared no attention for more celestial matters. In the summer of 1927, Henry Ford rang down the curtain on the immortal Model T and closed his plant to prepare for Model A. The Federal Reserve Index of Industrial Production receded, presumably as a result of the Ford shutdown, and there was general talk of depression. The effect on the market was imperceptible. At the end of the year, by which time production had also turned up again, the Times Industrials had reached 245, a net gain of 69 points for the year. The year 1927 is historic from another point of view in the lore of the stock market. According to a long-accepted doctrine, it was in this year that the seeds of the eventual disaster were sown. The responsibility rests with an act of generous but ill-advised internationalism. Some, including Mr. Hoover, have thought it almost disloyal, although in those days accusations of treason were still made with some caution. In 1925, under the aegis of the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Winston Churchill, Britain returned to the gold standard at the old or pre-World War I relationship between gold, dollars, and the pound. There is no doubt that Churchill was more impressed by the grandeur of the traditional, or $4.86 pound, than by the more subtle consequences of overvaluation, which he is widely assumed not to have understood. The consequences, nonetheless, were real and severe. Customers of Britain had now to use these costly pounds to buy goods at prices that still reflected wartime inflation. Britain was, accordingly, an unattractive place for foreigners to buy. For the same reason, it was an easy place in which to sell. In 1925 began the long series of exchange crises, which, like the lions in Trafalgar Square and the streetwalkers in Piccadilly, are now an established part of the British scene. There were also unpleasant domestic consequences. The bad market for coal and the effort to reduce costs and prices to meet world competition led to the general strike in 1926. Then, as since, gold, when it escaped from Britain or Europe, came to the United States. This might be discouraged if prices of goods were high and interest rates were low in this country. The United States would be a poor place in which to buy and invest. In the spring of 1927, 3 August Pilgrims, Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, the durable Hjalmar Schacht, then governor of the Reichsbank, and Charles Rist, the deputy governor of the Bank of France, came to the United States to urge an easy money policy. They had previously pled with success for a roughly similar policy in 1925. The Federal Reserve obliged. The rediscount rate of the New York Federal Reserve Bank was cut from 4 to 3.5%. Government securities were purchased in considerable volume, with the mathematical consequence of leaving the banks and individuals who had sold them with money to spare. Adolph C. Miller, a dissenting member of the Federal Reserve Board, subsequently described this as the greatest and boldest operation ever undertaken by the Federal Reserve System, and it resulted in one of the most costly errors committed by it or any other banking system in the last 75 years. The funds that the Federal Reserve made available were either invested in common stocks or, and more important, they became available to help finance the purchase of common stocks by others. So, provided with funds, people rushed into the market. Perhaps the most widely read of all the interpretations of the period, that of Professor Lionel Robbins of the London School of Economics, concludes, From that date, according to all the evidence, the situation got completely out of control. This view that the action of the Federal Reserve authorities in 1927 was responsible for the speculation and collapse which followed has never been seriously shaken. There are reasons why it is attractive. It is simple, and it exonerates both the American people and their economic system from any substantial blame. The danger of being guided by foreigners is well known, and Norman and Schacht had some special reputation for sinister motives. Yet the explanation obviously assumes that people will always speculate if only they can get the money to finance it. Nothing could be farther from the case. There were times before, and there have been long periods since, when credit was plentiful and cheap, far cheaper than in 1927 to 1929, and when speculation was negligible. Nor, as we shall see later, was speculation out of control after 1927, except that it was beyond the reach of men who did not want in the least to control it. The explanation is a tribute only to a recurrent preference, in economic matters, for formidable nonsense. 4. Until the beginning of 1928, even a man of conservative mind could believe that the prices of common stock were catching up with the increase in corporation earnings. The prospect for further increases, the peace and tranquility of the times, and the certainty that the administration then firmly in power in Washington would take no more than necessary of any earnings in taxes. Early in 1928, the nature of the boom changed. The mass escape into make-believe, so much a part of the true speculative orgy, started in earnest. It was still necessary to reassure those who required some tie, however tenuous, to reality. And, as will be seen presently, this process of reassurance, of inventing the industrial equivalents of the Florida climate, eventually achieved the status of a profession. However, the time had come, as in all periods of speculation, when men sought not to be persuaded of the reality of things, but to find excuses for escaping into the new world of fantasy. There were many indications by 1928 that this phase had come. Most obvious was the behavior of the market. While the winter months of 1928 were rather quiet, thereafter the market began to rise, not by slow, steady steps, but by great vaulting leaps. On occasion it also came down the same way, only to recover and go higher again. In March 1928, the industrial average rose nearly 25 points. News of the boiling market was frequently on the front page. Individual issues sometimes made gains of 10, 15, and 20 points in a single day's trading. On March 12th, radio, in many respects the speculative symbol of the time, gained 18 points. On the following day, it opened 22 points above the previous close. Then it lost 20 points on the announcement that the behavior of the trading in the stock was being investigated by the exchange, gained 15 points, and fell off 9. A few days later, on a strong market, it made another 18-point gain. The March boom also celebrated, beyond anything theretofore, the operations of the big professional traders. The lore of competitive markets pictures the stock exchange as the most impersonal of markets. No doctrine is more jealously guarded by the prophets and defenders of the stock exchange. The exchange is a marketplace where prices reflect the basic law of supply and demand. The New York Stock Exchange says firmly of itself. Yet even the most devout Wall Streeter allows himself on occasion to believe that more personal influences have a hand in his destiny. Somewhere around there are big men who put stocks up and put them down. As the boom developed, the big men became more and more omnipotent in the popular, or at least in the speculative view. In March, according to this view, the big men decided to put the market up, and even some serious scholars have been inclined to think that a concerted move catalyzed this upsurge. If so, the important figure was John J. Raskob. Raskob had impressive associations. He was a director of General Motors, an ally of the DuPonts, and soon to be chairman of the Democratic National Committee by choice of Al Smith. A contemporary student of the market, Professor Charles Amos Dice of The Ohio State University, thought this latter appointment a particular indication of the new prestige of Wall Street and the esteem in which it was held by the American people. Today, he observed, the shrewd, worldly wise candidate of one of the great political parties chooses one of the outstanding operators in the stock market as a goodwill creator and popular vote-getter. On March 23, 1928, on taking a ship for Europe, Raskob spoke favorably of prospects for automobile sales for the rest of the year and of the share in the business that General Motors would have. He may also have suggested, the evidence is not entirely clear, that GM stock should be selling at not less than 12 times earnings. This would have meant a price of $225, as compared with a current quotation of about $187. Such, as the Times put it, was the magic of his name that Mr. Raskob's temperate bit of optimism sent the market into a boiling fury. On March 24th, a Saturday, General Motors gained nearly 5 points, and the Monday following it went to 199. The surge in General Motors, meanwhile, set off a great burst of trading elsewhere in the list. Among the others who were assumed to have put their strength behind the market that spring was William Crapo Durant. Durant was the organizer of General Motors, whom Raskob and the DuPonts had thrown out of the company in 1920. After a further adventure in the auto business, he had turned to full-time speculation in the stock market. The 7 Fisher brothers were also believed to be influential. They too were General Motors alumni and had come to Wall Street with the great fortune they had realized from the sale of the Fisher body plants. Still another was Arthur W. Cutton, the Canadian-born grain speculator who had recently shifted his market operations to Wall Street from the Chicago Board of Trade. As a market operator, Cutton surmounted substantial personal handicaps. He was very hard of hearing, and some years later, before a congressional committee, even his own counsel conceded that his memory was very defective. Observing this group as a whole, Professor Dice was especially struck by their vision for the future and boundless hope and optimism. He noted that they did not come into the market hampered by the heavy armor of tradition. In recounting their effect on the market, Professor Dice obviously found the English language verging on inadequacy. Led by these mighty knights of the automobile industry, the steel industry, the radio industry, he said, and finally joined in despair by many professional traders who, after much sackcloth and ashes, had caught the vision of progress, the Coolidge market had gone forward like the phalanxes of Cyrus, parasang upon parasang, and again parasang upon parasang. 5. In June of 1928, the market retreated a parasang or two. In fact, the losses during the first 3 weeks were almost as great as the March gains. June 12th, a day of particularly heavy losses, was a landmark. For a year or more, men of vision had been saying that the day might come when 5 million shares would be traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Once, this had been only a wild conversational gambit, but for some time it had shown signs of being overtaken by the reality. On March 12th, the volume of trading had reached 3,875,910 shares, an all-time high. By the end of the month, such a volume had become commonplace. On March 27th, 4,790,270 shares were traded. Then, on June 12th, 5,052,790 shares changed hands. The ticker also fell nearly 2 hours behind the market. Radio dropped 23 points, and a New York paper began its account of the day's events. Wall Street's bull market collapsed yesterday, with a detonation heard round the world. The announcement of the death of the bull market was as premature as any since that of the death of Mark Twain. In July, there was a small net gain, and in August, a strong upsurge. Thereafter, not even the approach of the election caused serious hesitation. People remained unperturbed when, on September 17th, Roger W. Babson told an audience in Wellesley, Massachusetts, that If Smith should be elected with a Democratic Congress, we are almost certain to have a resulting business depression in 1929. He also said that the election of Hoover and a Republican Congress should result in continued prosperity for 1929. And it may have been that the public knew it would be Hoover. In any case, during the same month, reassurance came from still higher authority. Andrew W. Mellon said, "There is no cause for worry. The high tide of prosperity will continue." Mr. Mellon did not know. Neither did any of the other public figures who then, as since, made similar statements. These are not forecasts. It is not to be supposed that the men who make them are privileged to look farther into the future than the rest. Mr. Mellon was participating in a ritual, which, in our society, is thought to be of great value for influencing the course of the business cycle. By affirming solemnly that prosperity will continue, it is believed, one can help ensure that prosperity will, in fact, continue. Especially among businessmen, the faith in the efficiency of such incantation is very great. 6. Hoover was elected in a landslide. This, were the speculators privy to Mr. Hoover's mind, should have caused a heavy fall in the market. In his memoirs, Mr. Hoover states that as early as 1925, he became concerned over the growing tide of speculation. During the months and years that followed, this concern gradually changed to alarm, and then to something only slightly less than a premonition of total disaster. There are crimes, Mr. Hoover said of speculation, far worse than murder, for which men should be reviled and punished. As Secretary of Commerce, he had sought nothing so much as to get the market under control. Mr. Hoover's attitude toward the market was, however, an exceptionally well-kept secret. People did not know of his efforts, uniformly frustrated by Coolidge and the Federal Reserve Board, to translate his thoughts into action. The news of his election, so far from causing a panic, set off the greatest increase in buying to date. On November 7th, the day after the election, there was a victory boom, and the market leaders climbed 5 to 15 points. Volume reached 4,894,670 shares, or only a little less than the all-time record of June 12th. And this new level was reached on a rising, not a falling market. On November 16th, a further wave of buying hit the market. An astonishing 6,641,250 shares changed hands, far above the previous record. The Times Industrial Averages made a net gain of 4.5 points on the day's trading, then considered an impressive advance. Apart from the afterglow of the election, there was nothing particular to incite this enthusiasm. The headlines of the day told only of the sinking of the steamship Vestris and the epic achievements of the officers and crew in shouldering aside the women and children and saving their own lives. November 20th was another huge day. Trading, 6,503,230 shares, was fractionally smaller than on the 16th. But by common agreement, it was much more frantic. The following morning, the Times observed that, for cyclonic violence, yesterday's stock market has never been exceeded in the history of Wall Street. December was not so good. Early in the month, there was a bad break, and on December 8th, radio fell a ghastly 72 points in one day. However, the market steadied and then came back. Over the whole year of 1928, the Times Industrial Average gained 86 points, or from 245 to 331. During the year, radio went from 85 to 420. It had never paid a dividend. DuPont went from 310 to 525. Montgomery Ward from 117 to 440. Wright Aeronautic from 69 to 289. During the year, 920,550,032 shares were traded on the New York Stock Exchange, as compared with a record-breaking 576,990,875 in 1927. But there was still another and even more significant index of what was happening in the market. That was the phenomenal increase in trading on margin. 7. As noted, at some point in the growth of a boom, all aspects of property ownership become irrelevant, except the prospect for an early rise in price. Income from the property, or enjoyment of its use, or even its long-run worth is now academic. As in the case of the more repulsive Florida lots, these usufructs may be non-existent or even negative. What is important is that tomorrow or next week, market values will rise, as they did yesterday or last week, and a profit can be realized. It follows that the only reward to ownership in which the boom time owner has an interest is the increase in values. Could the right to the increased value be somehow divorced from the other and now unimportant fruits of possession, and also from as many as possible of the burdens of ownership? This would be much welcomed by the speculator. Such an arrangement would enable him to concentrate on speculation, which, after all, is the business of a speculator. Such is the genius of capitalism that where a real demand exists, it does not go long unfilled. In all great speculative orgies, devices have appeared to enable the speculator so to concentrate on his business. In the Florida boom, the trading was in binders. Not the land itself, but the right to buy the land at a stated price was traded. This right to buy, which was obtained by a down payment of 10% of the purchase price, could be sold. It thus conferred on the speculators the full benefit of the increase in values. After the value of the lot had risen, he could resell the binder for what he had paid, plus the full amount of the increase in price. The worst of the burdens of ownership, whether of land or any other asset, is the need to put up the cash represented by the purchase price. The use of the binder cut this burden by 90%, or it multiplied tenfold the amount of acreage from which the speculator could harvest an increase in value. The buyer happily gave up the other advantages of ownership. These included the current income, of which invariably there was none, and the prospect of permanent use, in which he had not the slightest interest. The stock market also has its design for concentrating the speculative energies of the speculator, and, as might be expected, it improves substantially on the crudities of the real estate market. In the stock market, the buyer of securities on margin gets full title to his property in an unconditional sale. But he rids himself of the most grievous burden of ownership, that of putting up the purchase price, by leaving his securities with his broker as collateral for the loan that paid for them. The buyer again gets the full benefit of any increase in value. The price of the securities goes up, but the loan that bought them does not. In the stock market, the speculative buyer also gets the earnings of the securities he purchased. However, in the days of this history, the earnings were almost invariably less than the interest that was paid on the loan. Often they were much less. Yields on securities regularly ranged from nothing to 1 or 2%. Interest on the loans that carried them was often 8, 10, or more %. The speculator was willing to pay to divest himself of all of the usufructs of security ownership, except the chance for a capital gain. The machinery by which Wall Street separates the opportunity to speculate from the unwanted returns and burdens of ownership is ingenious, precise, and almost beautiful. Banks supply funds to brokers, brokers to customers, and the collateral goes back to banks in a smooth and all but automatic flow. Margins, the cash which the speculator must supply in addition to the securities to protect the loan, and which he must augment if the value of the collateral securities should fall and so lower the protection they provide, are effortlessly calculated and watched. The interest rate moves quickly and easily to keep the supply of funds adjusted to the demand. Wall Street, however, has never been able to express its pride in these arrangements. They are admirable and even wonderful only in relation to the purpose they serve. The purpose is to accommodate the speculator and facilitate speculation. But the purposes cannot be admitted. If Wall Street confessed this purpose, many thousands of moral men and women would have no choice but to condemn it for nurturing an evil thing and call for reform. Margin trading must be defended not on the grounds that it efficiently and ingeniously assists the speculator, but that it encourages the extra trading, which changes a thin and anemic market into a thick and healthy one. At best, this is a dull byproduct and a dubious one. Wall Street, in these matters, is like a lovely and accomplished woman who must wear black cotton stockings, heavy woolen underwear, and parade her knowledge as a cook, because, unhappily, her supreme accomplishment is as a harlot. However, even the most circumspect friend of the market would concede that the volume of brokers' loans, of loans collateraled by the securities purchased on margin, is a good index of the volume of speculation. Measured by this index, the amount of speculation was rising very fast in 1928. Early in the 20s, the volume of brokers' loans, because of their liquidity, they are often referred to as call loans or loans in the call market, varied from $1 billion to $1.5 billion. By early 1926, they had increased to $2.5 billion and remained at about that level for most of the year. During 1927, there was another increase of about $1 billion, and at the end of the year, they reached $3,480,780,000. This was an incredible sum, but it was only the beginning. In the 2 dull winter months of 1928, there was a small decline, and then expansion began in earnest. Brokers' loans reached $4 billion on the 1st of June 1928, $5 billion on the 1st of November, and by the end of the year, they were well along to $6 billion. Never had there been anything like it before. People were swarming to buy stocks on margin. In other words, to have the increase in price without the cost of ownership. The cost was being assumed, in the first instance, by the New York banks, but they, in turn, were rapidly becoming the agents for lenders the country over, and even the world around. There is no mystery as to why so many wished to lend so much in New York. One of the paradoxes of speculation in securities is that the loans that underwrite it are among the safest of all investments. They are protected by stocks, which under all ordinary circumstances are instantly saleable, and by a cash margin as well. The money, as noted, can be retrieved on demand. At the beginning of 1928, this admirably liquid and exceptionally secure outlet for non-risk capital was paying around 5%. While 5% is an excellent gilt-edged return, the rate rose steadily through 1928, and during the last week of the year, it reached 12%. This was still with complete safety. In Montreal, London, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, there was talk of these rates. Everywhere, men of means told themselves that 12% was 12%. A great river of gold began to converge on Wall Street. All of it to help Americans hold common stock on margin. Corporations also found these rates attractive. At 12%, Wall Street might even provide a more profitable use for the working capital of a company than additional production. A few firms made this decision. Instead of trying to produce goods with its manifold headaches and inconveniences, they confined themselves to financing speculation. Many more companies started lending their surplus funds on Wall Street. There were still better ways of making money. In principle, New York banks could borrow money from the Federal Reserve Bank for 5% and re-lend it in the call market for 12%. In practice, they did. This was possibly the most profitable arbitrage operation of all time. 8. However, there were many ways of making money in 1928. Never had there been a better time to get rich, and people knew it. 1928, indeed, was the last year in which Americans were buoyant, uninhibited, and utterly happy. It wasn't that 1928 was too good to last. It was only that it didn't last. In the January issue of World's Work, Will Payne, after reflecting on the wonders of the year just over, went on to explain the difference between a gambler and an investor. A gambler, he pointed out, wins only because someone else loses. Where it is investment is all gain. One investor, he explained, buys General Motors at $100, sells it to another at $150, who sells it to a third at $200. Everyone makes money, As Walter Bagehot once observed, all people are most credulous when they are most happy. Chapter 2. Something should be done? Purely in retrospect, it is easy to see how 1929 was destined to be a year to remember. This was not because Mr. Hoover was soon to become president and had inimical intentions toward the market. Those intentions developed at least partly in retrospect. Nor was it because men of wisdom could tell that a depression was overdue. No one, wise or unwise, knew or now knows when depressions are due or overdue. Rather, it was simply that a roaring boom was in progress in the stock market, and, like all booms, it had to end. On the 1st of January of 1929, as a simple matter of probability, it was most likely that the boom would end before the year was out, with a diminishing chance that it would end in any given year thereafter. When prices stopped rising, when the supply of people who were buying for an increase was exhausted, then ownership on margin would become meaningless, and everyone would want to sell. The market wouldn't level out. It would fall precipitately. All this being so, the position of the people who had at least nominal responsibility for what was going on was a complex one. One of the oldest puzzles of politics is who is to regulate the regulators. But an equally baffling problem, which has never received the attention it deserves, is who is to make wise those who are required to have wisdom. Some of those in positions of authority wanted the boom to continue. They were making money out of it, and they may have had an intimation of the personal disaster which awaited them when the boom came to an end. But there were also some who saw, however dimly, that a wild speculation was in progress and that something should be done. For these people, however, every proposal to act raised the same intractable problem. The consequences of successful action seemed almost as terrible as the consequences of inaction, and they could be more horrible for those who took the action. A bubble can easily be punctured, but to incise it with a needle so that it subsides gradually is a task of no small delicacy. Among those who sensed what was happening in early 1929, there was some hope, but no confidence, that the boom could be made to subside. The real choice was between an immediate and deliberately engineered collapse and a more serious disaster later on. Someone would certainly be blamed for the ultimate collapse when it came. There was no question whatever as to who would be blamed should the boom be deliberately deflated. For nearly a decade, the Federal Reserve authorities had been denying their responsibility for the deflation of 1920 to 1921. The eventual disaster also had the inestimable advantage of allowing a few more days, weeks, or months of life. One may doubt if at any time in early 1929, the problem was ever framed in terms of quite such stark alternatives. But however disguised or evaded, these were the choices which haunted every serious conference on what to do about the market. 2. The men who had responsibility for these ineluctable choices were the President of the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, and the Governor and Directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. As the most powerful of the Federal Reserve banks, and the one with the market at its doorstep, the New York Bank both had and assumed responsibilities which were not accepted by the other 11 banks of the system. President Coolidge neither knew nor cared what was going on. A few days before leaving office in 1929, he cheerily observed that things were absolutely sound and that stocks were cheap at current prices. In earlier years, whenever warned that speculation was getting out of hand, he had comforted himself with the thought that this was the primary responsibility of the Federal Reserve Board. The board was a semi-autonomous body precisely because Congress wanted to protect it from excessive political interference by the executive. However tender his scruples, President Coolidge could have acted through his Secretary of the Treasury, who served ex officio as a member of the Federal Reserve Board. The Secretary also had the primary responsibility for economic and especially for financial policy. But on this, as on other matters of economic policy, the incumbent, Andrew W. Mellon, was a passionate advocate of inaction. The responsibility thus passed to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The regulation of economic activity is, without doubt, the most inelegant and unrewarding of public endeavors. Almost everyone is opposed to it in principle. Its justification always relies on the unprepossessing case for the lesser evil. Regulation originates in raucous debate in Congress, in which the naked interests of pressure groups may, at times, involve an exposure bordering on the obscene. Promulgation and enforcement of rules and regulations is by grinding bureaucracies, which are ceaselessly buffeted by criticism. In recent times, it has become obligatory for the regulators at every opportunity to confess their inadequacy, which in any case is all too evident. The great exception to this dreary story is the regulatory activity of the central bank. With us, the Federal Reserve System. Here is regulation of a seemly and becoming sort. No one apologizes for it. Men of impeccable conservatism would rise to espouse such regulation were they called upon to do so, which they almost never are. This regulation is not the work of thousands of clerks, statisticians, hearing officers, lawyers, and lesser beings in a teeming office building on the Mall. Rather, it emerges in the measured and orderly discussion of men of quiet and dignified mien, each at his accustomed place around a handsome table in a richly paneled and richly draperied room. These men do not issue orders. At most, they suggest. Chiefly, they move interest rates, buy or sell securities, and in doing so, nudge the economy here and restrain it there. Because the meanings of their actions are not understood by the great majority of the people, they can reasonably be assumed to have superior wisdom. Their actions will on occasion be criticized. More often they will be scrutinized for hidden meaning. Such is the mystique of central banking. Such was the awe-inspiring role in 1929 of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, the policy-making body which guided and directed the 12 Federal Reserve Banks. However, there was a jarring difficulty. The Federal Reserve Board in those times was a body of startling incompetence. For several years, until late in 1927, the chairman and guiding genius presumptive was one Daniel R. Crissinger. He had been trained for his task by serving as general counsel of the Marion Steam Shovel Company of Marion, Ohio. There is no indication that he was an apt student. However, his background seemed satisfactory to another Marion boy, Warren G. Harding, who had brought him to Washington, where he was regarded as a hack politician from Ohio. In 1927, Crissinger was replaced by Roy A. Young, who for 8 years had been governor of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. Young, a more substantial figure, was undoubtedly aware of what was going on. However, he was a man of caution, who sought no fame as a martyr to the broken boom. His colleagues were among the more commonplace of Harding-Coolidge appointees. With one exception, the erstwhile college professor Adolph C. Miller, they have been conservatively described by Herbert Hoover as mediocrities. The New York Federal Reserve Bank was under more vigorous leadership. For several years, until 1928, its governor had been Benjamin Strong, the first American since Nicholas Biddle to make an important reputation as a central banker. Strong's views were regarded throughout the system with only little less awe than the gold standard. However, in the view of Herbert Hoover, and in this instance Hoover's views are widely shared, Strong, so far from being concerned about the inflation, was the man most responsible for it. It was he who took the lead in 1927 in easing money rates to help the hard-pressed Europeans. For this, Mr. Hoover later called him a mental annex to Europe. This is unfair. Governor Strong's action was entirely reasonable in the circumstances, and, as noted in the last chapter, it takes more to start a speculation than a general ability to borrow money. Still, the New York Federal Reserve Bank, under Governor Strong's leadership, may not have been sufficiently perturbed by the speculation a block or two away, nor was it after Governor Strong died in October 1928 and was replaced by George L. Harrison. A reason, no doubt, was the reassurance provided by people in high places who were themselves speculating heavily. One such was Charles E. Mitchell, the chairman of the board of the National City Bank, who on January 1, 1929, became a Class A director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The end of the boom would mean the end of Mitchell. He was not a man to expedite his own demise. 3. In the accepted history of these times, the Federal Reserve authorities are held to be not so much unaware or unwilling as impotent. They would have liked to stop the boom, but they lacked the means. This puts far too elaborate a face on matters, and it largely disguises the real nature of the dilemma which the authorities faced. The classic instruments of control were indeed largely useless. These, as almost every college sophomore knows, are two: open market operations and the manipulation of the rediscount rate. Open market sales of government securities by the Federal Reserve bring to the vaults of the reserve banks the cash which is paid for the securities. There, it remains sterile and harmless. Had it stayed in the commercial banks, it would have been loaned to the public in multiple volume, and particularly in those days to people who were buying common stocks. If such a policy is to succeed, the Federal Reserve System rather obviously must have securities to sell. One of the inestimable blessings of the years of depression, war, and deficit financing since 1930 is a spacious inventory of government debt in the reserve banks. In 1929, the banks were not so well endowed. At the beginning of 1928, holdings were $617 million. During the first half of the year, there were heavy sales as part of an effort to dry up the supply of funds that was feeding the market. Although sales were discontinued in the latter part of the year, in the highly erroneous belief that the policy had succeeded and that the boom was under control, they couldn't have been continued much longer in any case. By the end of 1928, the inventory of government securities of the Federal Reserve System amounted to only $228 million. Had these all been dropped into the market, they might possibly have had some effect, but the board was not given to any such drastic behavior, which, incidentally, would also have largely denuded the reserve banks of earning assets. Sales were made a few millions at a time in the early months of 1929, but the effect was inconsequential. Moreover, even in following this feeble policy, the board worried lest, in denying funds to the stock market, it might put a pinch on legitimate business. The reserve banks continued to buy acceptances, the security that emerges in the course of financing ordinary, non-speculative trade, and, relieved of the need to carry this paper, the commercial banks happily loaned more money in the stock market. The other instrument of Federal Reserve policy was the rediscount rate. This is the rate at which member commercial banks borrow from the reserve banks of their district so that they may accommodate more borrowers than their own resources permit. In January 1929, the rediscount rate at the New York Federal Reserve Bank was 5%. The rate on brokers' loans ranged from 6 to 12%. Only a drastic increase would have made it unprofitable for a bank to borrow at the Federal Reserve in order to lend the proceeds, directly or indirectly, in the stock market. Apart from the general aversion to drastic action, such an increase would also have raised rates to ordinary businessmen, consumers, and farmers. In fact, higher interest rates would have been distressing to everyone but the speculator. A man who paid, say, an average of 10% to carry his holdings of radio through 1928 would not have been either deterred or much disturbed had the rate been twice that high. During the same year, he made 500% on the appreciation in the value of his investment. On February 14, 1929, the New York Federal Reserve Bank proposed that the rediscount rate be raised from 5 to 6% to check speculation. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington thought this a meaningless gesture, which would only increase rates to business borrowers. A long controversy ensued, in which President Hoover sided with the board against the bank. The rate was not increased until late in the summer. There was another circumstance which gave the reserve authorities an admirable excuse for inaction. That was the previously noted flow of funds from corporations and individuals to the market. During 1929, Standard Oil of New Jersey contributed a daily average of $69 million to the call market. Electric Bond and Share averaged over $100 million. A few corporations, Citi's Service was one, even sold securities and loaned the proceeds in the stock market. By early 1929, loans from these non-banking sources were approximately equal to those from the banks. Later, they became much greater. The Federal Reserve authorities took for granted that they had no influence whatever over this supply of funds. 4. In fact, the Federal Reserve was helpless only because it wanted to be. Had it been determined to do something, it could, for example, have asked Congress for authority to halt trading on margin by granting the board the power to set margin requirements. Margins were not low in 1929. A residue of caution had caused most brokers to require customers to put up in cash 45 to 50% of the value of the stocks they were buying. However, this was all the cash numerous of their customers had. An increase in margins to, say, 75% in January 1929, or even a serious proposal to do so, would have caused many small speculators and quite a few big ones to sell. The boom would have come to a sudden and perhaps spectacular end. The power to fix margin requirements was eventually given to the Federal Reserve Board by the Securities Exchange Act in 1934, a year in which the danger of a revival of speculation about equaled that of a renaissance of prohibition. Actually, not even new legislation, or the threat of it, was needed. In 1929, a robust denunciation of speculators and speculation by someone in high authority, and a warning that the market was too high, would almost certainly have broken the spell. It would have brought some people back from the world of make-believe. Those who were planning to stay in the market as long as possible but still get out, or go short, in time would have got out or gone short. Their occupational nervousness could readily have been translated into an acute desire to sell. Once the selling started, some more vigorously voiced pessimism could easily have kept it going. The very effectiveness of such a measure was the problem. Of all the weapons in the Federal Reserve arsenal, words were the most unpredictable in their consequences. Their effect might be sudden and terrible. Moreover, these consequences could be attributed with the greatest of precision to the person or persons who uttered the words. Retribution would follow. To the more cautious of the Federal Reserve officials in the early part of 1929, silence seemed literally golden. Yet the boom was continuing. In January, the Times Industrials gained 30 points, more than during the post-election spree in November. Brokers' loans went up a whopping $260 million. On 5 different days, 3 of them as the market got off to a boiling start right after New Year's, trading on the New York Stock Exchange exceeded the magic 5 million mark. Effective action would be disastrous. Yet some actions seemed unavoidable. Finally, the board decided to write a letter and issue a press release. It could do no less. On February 2nd, it addressed the individual reserve banks as follows. A member, commercial bank, is not within its reasonable claims for rediscount facilities at its reserve bank when it borrows either for the purpose of making speculative loans or for the purpose of maintaining speculative loans. The board has no disposition to assume authority to interfere with the loan practices of member banks, so long as they do not involve the Federal Reserve banks. It has, however, a grave responsibility whenever there is evidence that member banks are maintaining speculative security loans with the aid of Federal Reserve credit. On February 7th, in what may be an even finer example of fiduciary prose, connoisseurs will wish to read it backward as well as forward, the board warned the public, "When the board finds that conditions are arising which obstruct the Federal Reserve banks in the effective discharge of their functions of so managing the credit facilities of the Federal Reserve System as to accommodate commerce and business, it is its duty to inquire into them and to take such measures as may be deemed suitable and effective in the circumstances to correct them, which in the immediate situation means to restrain the use either directly or indirectly, of Federal Reserve facilities in aid of the growth of speculative credit. Almost simultaneously with this warning came the news that the Bank of England was raising the bank rate from 4.5% to 5.5% in an effort to diminish the flow of British funds to the new Golconda. The result was a sharp break in the market. On February 7th, in a 5 million share day, the Times Industrials dropped 11 points, with a further drop on the day following. Thereafter, the market recovered, but for February as a whole, there was no appreciable net gain. Economists have long had a phrase for this action. It was called the Federal Reserve's effort at moral suasion. Since the market was only temporarily checked, there has been ever since virtually complete agreement that moral suasion was a failure. Precisely the opposite conclusion could and probably should have been drawn. It is impossible to imagine a milder, more tentative, more palpably panic-stricken communiqué than that issued by the board. The statement that the board had no intention of interfering with loans to support speculation, so long as Federal Reserve credit was not involved, is especially noteworthy. Clearly, the Federal Reserve was less interested in checking speculation than in detaching itself from responsibility for the speculation that was going on. And it will be observed that some anonymous draftsmen achieved a wording which indicated that not the present level, but only a further growth in speculation would be viewed with alarm. Yet, in the then state of nervousness, even these almost incredibly feeble words caused a sharp setback. 5. The nervousness of the market and the unsuspected moral authority of the equally nervous men of the Federal Reserve was even better illustrated in March. As the new month approached, Mr. Coolidge made his blithe observation about stocks being cheap and the country being sound. The market surged up in what the papers dubbed the inaugural market, and on March 4th, his attitude toward speculators still unknown, Mr. Hoover took over. The market for the next couple of weeks remained strong. Then, toward the end of the month, disquieting news reached Wall Street. The Federal Reserve Board was meeting daily in Washington. It issued no statements. Newspapermen pressed the members after the sessions and were met with what then, as now, was known as tight-lipped silence. There was not a hint as to what the meetings were about, although everyone knew they concerned the market. The meetings continued day after day, and there was also an unprecedented Saturday session. Soon, it was too much. On Monday, March 25th, the first market day following the unseemly Saturday meeting, the tension became unbearable. Although, or rather because, Washington was still silent, people began to sell. Speculative favorites, commercial solvents, Wright Arrow, American Railway Express, dropped 10 or 12 points or more. The Times Industrial Average was off 9.5 points for the day. More important, some banks decided that, in the event of a Federal Reserve crackdown, virtue might have a reward above revenue. They began curtailing their loans in the call market, and the rate on brokers' loans went to 14%. On the next day, Tuesday, March 26th, everything was much worse. The Federal Reserve Board was still maintaining its by now demoralizing silence. A wave of fear swept the market. More people decided to sell, and they sold in astonishing volume. An amazing 8,246,740 shares changed hands on the New York Stock Exchange, far above any previous record. Prices seemed to drop vertically. At the low for the day, 20 and 30-point losses were commonplace. The Times Industrials at one time were 15 points below the previous day's close. Thousands of speculators, in whose previous experience the market had always risen, now saw for the first time the seamy side of their new way of life. Each new quotation was far below the last one. Moreover, the ticker, unable to cope with the unprecedented volume, was far behind the market. Not only were things bad, but they had almost certainly become worse. Yet one couldn't tell from the ticker how much worse. Before the day was out, many of these thousands received a peremptory telegram from their brokers, a telegram that was in the starkest of contrast with the encouraging, half-confidential, rich uncle tone of all previous communications. It asked more margin promptly. Meanwhile, the banks continued to trim sails for the storm. It is probable that some professional traders were selling because they foresaw the moment when there would be no money with which to carry stocks on margin, and that moment might be near. For on the morning of March 26th, the rate on call money reached 20%, its high for the 1929 boom. March 26, 1929 could have been the end. Money could have remained tight. The authorities might have remained firm in their intention to keep it so. The panic might have continued. Each fall in prices would have forced a new echelon of speculators to sell, and so forced prices down still more. It did not happen, and if any man can be credited with this, the credit belongs to Charles E. Mitchell. The Federal Reserve authorities were ambivalent, but Mitchell was not. He was for the boom. Moreover, his prestige as head of one of the two largest and most influential commercial banks, his reputation as an aggressive and highly successful investment banker, and his position as a director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank meant that he spoke with at least as much authority as anyone in Washington. During the day, as money tightened, rates rose, and the market fell, Mitchell decided to take a hand. He told the press, "We feel that we have an obligation, which is paramount to any Federal Reserve warning or anything else, to avert any dangerous crisis in the money market. The national city," he said, "would loan money as necessary to prevent liquidation. It would also, and did, borrow from the New York Federal Reserve Bank to do what the Federal Reserve Board had warned against doing." Disguised only slightly by the prose form of finance, Mitchell issued the Wall Street counterpart of Mayor Haig's famous manifesto, "I am the law in Jersey City." Mitchell's words were like magic. By the end of trading on the 26th, money rates had eased, and the market had rallied. The Federal Reserve remained silent, but now its silence was reassuring. It meant that it conceded Mitchell's mastery. The next day, the national city regularized its commitment to the boom. It announced that it would ensure reasonable interest rates by putting $25 million into the call market, $5 million when the rate was 16%, and $5 million additional dollars for each percentage point. In its monthly letter a few days later, the bank justified its position and, incidentally, gave an admirable statement of the dilemma which the Federal Reserve faced. The national city was in no doubt which horn of the dilemma it preferred. The letter said, "The National City Bank fully recognizes the dangers of over-speculation and endorses the desire of the Federal Reserve authorities to restrain excessive credit expansion for this purpose. At the same time, the bank, business generally, and it may be assumed the Federal Reserve banks, wish to avoid a general collapse of the securities markets such as would have a disastrous effect on business." 6. Mitchell did not escape criticism. A Senate investigation was mentioned. Senator Carter Glass, who, as the sponsor of the Federal Reserve legislation, had a keen proprietary interest in its operation, said, "He avows his superior obligation to a frantic stock market over against the obligation of his oath as a director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. The bank should ask for his immediate resignation. That the Federal Reserve Board never dreamed of doing any such thing may be taken as a further indication that its moral suasion was being administered with a very infirm touch." And the Federal Reserve was criticized even more than Mitchell, even though it could hardly have done less than it did. Arthur Brisbane said judiciously, "If buying and selling stocks is wrong, the government should close the stock exchange. If not, the Federal Reserve should mind its own business." In a leading article in Barron's, a Mr. Seth Axley was less even-handed. For the Federal Reserve Board to deny investors the means of recognizing economies which are now proved, skill which is now learned, and inventions which are almost unbelievable seems to justify doubt whether it is adequately interpreting the times. Since the principal action which the Federal Reserve had taken against investors had been to hold meetings and maintain silence, this was doubtless a trifle harsh. However, it was positively kind as compared with the words of a young Princeton scholar who emerged at this time as a leading defender of Wall Street. Joseph Stagg Lawrence's book, Wall Street and Washington, when it appeared later in the year bearing the distinguished imprimatur of the Princeton University Press, was described by a leading financial journal as a breath of fresh air. The regulatory concern of the Federal Reserve about Wall Street, Mr. Lawrence said in this remarkable volume, was motivated strictly by bias. A bias founded upon a clash of interests and a moral and intellectual antipathy between the wealthy, cultured, and conservative settlements on the seacoast, including Wall Street, and the poverty-stricken, illiterate, and radical pioneer communities of the interior. The cultured and conservative Mr. Lawrence also had hard words for the defenders of the Federal Reserve in the Senate, including, oddly enough, the Seacoast Senator from Virginia, Carter Glass. It seems incredible that in the year of our grace 1929, a body of presumably intelligent public men should permit fanatical passions and provincial ignorance to find expression in unrestrained virulence. Yet this is precisely what has taken place. When the senator from the Old Dominion rose in that chamber of absurdities, sometimes referred to as a deliberative assembly, his remarks were characterized by neither reason nor restraint. Blatant bigotry and turbulent provincialism have joined to condemn an innocent community. Some hardened Wall Streeters may have been surprised when they realized that the innocent community meant them. 7. After the defeat by Mitchell in March, the Federal Reserve retired from the field. There continued to be some slight anxiety as to what it might do. In April, William Crapo Durant is supposed to have paid a secret night visit to the White House to warn President Hoover that if the board were not called off, it would precipitate a terrible crash. The president was noncommittal, and Durant is said to have reduced his holdings before leaving on a trip to Europe. In June from Princeton, Mr. Lawrence said that the board was still doing its utmost to cast the proverbial monkey wrench into the machinery of prosperity. He warned the board that it had aroused the enmity of an honest, intelligent, and public-spirited community. This also was Wall Street. But the board, in fact, had decided to leave that honest, intelligent, and public-spirited community strictly to its own devices. It realized, Governor Young said subsequently, that while the hysteria might be somewhat restrained, it would have to run its course, and the reserve banks could only brace themselves for the inevitable collapse. More accurately, the Federal Reserve authorities had decided not to be responsible for the collapse. In August, the board finally agreed to an increase in the rediscount rate to 6%. The market weakened only for a day. Any conceivable consequence of the action was nullified by a simultaneous easing of the buying rate on acceptances. In fact, from the end of March on, the market had nothing further to fear from authority. President Hoover did ask Henry M. Robinson, a Los Angeles banker, to proceed as his emissary to New York and talk to the bankers there about the boom. According to Mr. Hoover, Robinson was assured that things were sound. Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange, was also summoned to the White House and told that something should be done about speculation. Nothing was done, and Mr. Hoover was able to find some solace in the thought that primary responsibility for regulating the stock exchange rested with the governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt, too, was following a laissez-faire policy, at least on the matter of the stock market. A firm of investment counselors in Boston, called McNeil's Financial Service, describing itself with a deft Back Bay touch as an aristocracy of successful investors, advertised a new guide to investment. The headline read, "He made $70,000 after reading Beating the Stock Market." No doubt whoever it was did. He might have made it without reading the volume or without being able to read. For now, free at last from all threat of government reaction or retribution, the market sailed off into the wild blue yonder. Especially after June 1st, all hesitation disappeared. Never before or since have so many become so wondrously, so effortlessly, and so quickly rich. Perhaps Messrs. Hoover and Mellon and the Federal Reserve were right in keeping their hands off. Perhaps it was worth being poor for a long time to be so rich for just a little while. Chapter 3. In Goldman Sachs We Trust. The recondite problems of Federal Reserve policy were not the only questions that were agitating Wall Street intellectuals in the early months of 1929. There was worry that the country might be running out of common stocks. One reason prices of stocks were so high, it was explained, was that there weren't enough to go around, and accordingly, they had acquired a scarcity value. Some issues, it was said, were becoming so desirable that they would soon be taken out of the market and would not reappear at any price. If indeed common stocks were becoming scarce, it was in spite of as extraordinary a response of supply to demand as any in the history of that well-worn relationship. Without doubt, the most striking feature of the financial era, which ended in the autumn of 1929, was the desire of people to buy securities and the effect of this on values. But the increase in the number of securities to buy was hardly less striking, and the ingenuity and zeal with which companies were devised in which securities might be sold was as remarkable as anything. Not all of the increase in the volume of securities in 1928 and 1929 was for the sole purpose of accommodating the speculator. It was a good time to raise money for general corporate purposes. Investors would supply capital with enthusiasm and without tedious questions. Seaboard Airline was a speculative favorite of the period, in part because many supposed it to be an aviation stock with growth possibilities. In these years of prosperity, men with a vision of still greater prosperity stretching on and forever naturally saw the importance of being well provided with plant and working capital. This was no time to be niggardly. Also, it was an age of consolidation, and each new merger required, inevitably, some new capital and a new issue of securities to pay for it. A word must be said about the merger movement of the 20s. It was not the first such movement, but in many respects it was the first of its kind. Just before and just after the turn of the century, in industry after industry, small companies were combined into large ones. The United States Steel Corporation, International Harvester, International Nickel, American Tobacco, and numerous other of the great corporations traced to this period. In these cases, the firms which were combined produced the same or related products for the same national market. The primary motivation in all but the rarest cases was to reduce, eliminate, or regularize competition. Each of the new giants dominated an industry, and henceforth exercised measurable control over prices and production, and perhaps also over investment and the rate of technological innovation. A few such mergers occurred in the 20s. Mostly, however, the mergers of this period brought together not firms in competition with each other, but firms doing the same thing in different communities. Local electric, gas, water, bus, and milk companies were united in great regional or national systems. The purpose was not to eliminate competition, but rather the incompetence, somnambulance, naivete, or even the unwarranted integrity of local managements. In the 20s, a man in downtown New York or Chicago could take unabashed pride in the fact that he was a financial genius. The local owners and managers were not. There was no false modesty when it came to citing the advantages of displacing yokels with a central management of decent sophistication. In the case of utilities, the instrument for accomplishing this centralization of management and control was the holding company. These bought control of the operating companies. On occasion, they bought control of other holding companies, which controlled yet other holding companies, which in turn, directly or indirectly through yet other holding companies, controlled the operating companies. Everywhere, local power, gas, and water companies passed into the possession of a holding company system. Food retailing, variety stores, department stores, and motion picture theaters showed a similar, although not precisely identical, development. Here, too, local ownership gave way to central direction and control. The instrument of this centralization, however, was not the holding company, but the corporate chain. These, more often than not, instead of taking over existing businesses, established new outlets. The holding companies issued securities in order to buy operating properties, and the chains issued securities in order to build new stores and theaters. While in the years before 1929, the burgeoning utility systems, Associated Gas and Electric, Commonwealth and Southern, and the Insull companies, attracted great attention, the chains were at least as symbolic of the era. Montgomery Ward was one of the prime speculative favorites of the period. It owed its eminence to the fact that it was a chain, and thus had a particularly bright future. The same was true of Woolworth, American Stores, and others. Interest in branch and chain banking was also strong, and it was widely felt that state and federal laws were an archaic barrier to a consolidation which would knit the small town and small city banks into a few regional and national systems. Various arrangements for defeating the intent of the law, most notably bank holding companies, were highly regarded. Inevitably, promoters organized some new companies merely to capitalize on the public interest in industries with a new and wide horizon and provide securities to sell. Radio and aviation stocks were believed to have a particularly satisfactory prospect, and companies were formed which never had more than a prospect. In September 1929, an advertisement in the Times called attention to the impending arrival of television and said with considerable prescience that the commercial possibilities of this new art defy imagination. The ad opined, somewhat less presciently, that sets would be in use in homes that fall. However, in the main, the market boom of 1929 was rooted directly or indirectly in existing industries and enterprises. New and fanciful issues for new and fanciful purposes, ordinarily so important in times of speculation, played a relatively small part. No significant amount of stock was sold in companies to make salt water fresh, for building of hospitals for bastard children, for building of ships against pirates, for importing a number of large jackasses from Spain, or even for a wheel of perpetual motion, to cite a representative list of promotions at the time of the South Sea bubble. 2. The most notable piece of speculative architecture of the late 20s, and the one by which, more than any other device, the public demand for common stocks was satisfied, was the investment trust or company. The investment trust did not promote new enterprises or enlarge old ones. It merely arranged that people could own stock in old companies through the medium of new ones. Even in the United States, in the 20s, there were limits to the amount of real capital which existing enterprises could use or new ones could be created to employ. The virtue of the investment trust was that it brought about an almost complete divorce of the volume of corporate securities outstanding from the volume of corporate assets in existence. The former could be twice, thrice, or any multiple of the latter. The volume of underwriting business and of securities available for trading on the exchanges all expanded accordingly. So did the securities to own, for the investment trusts sold more securities than they bought. The difference went into the call market, real estate, or the pockets of the promoters. It is hard to imagine an invention better suited to the time or one better designed to eliminate the anxiety about the possible shortage of common stocks. The idea of the investment trust is an old one, although, oddly enough, it came late to the United States. Since the 1880s in England and Scotland, investors, mostly smaller ones, had pooled their resources by buying stock in an investment company. The latter, in turn, invested the funds so secured. A typical trust held securities in from 500 to 1,000 operating companies. As a result, the man with a few pounds, or even a few hundred, was able to spread his risk far more widely than were he himself to invest. and the management of the trusts could be expected to have a far better knowledge of companies and prospects in Singapore, Madras, Cape Town, and the Argentine, places to which British funds regularly found their way, than the widow in Bristol or the doctor in Glasgow. The smaller risk and better information well justified the modest compensation of those who managed the enterprise. Despite some early misadventures, the investment trusts soon became an established part of the British scene. Before 1921 in the United States, only a few small companies existed for the primary purpose of investing in the securities of other companies. In that year, interest in investment trusts began to develop, partly as the result of a number of newspaper and magazine articles describing the English and Scottish trusts. The United States, it was pointed out, had not been keeping abreast of the times. Other countries were excelling us in fiduciary innovation. Soon, however, we began to catch up. More trusts were organized, and by the beginning of 1927, an estimated 160 were in existence. Another 140 were formed during that year. The managers of the British trusts normally enjoy the greatest of discretion in investing the funds placed at their disposal. At first, the American promoters were wary of asking for such a vote of confidence. Many of the early trusts were trusts. The investor bought an interest in a specified assortment of securities, which were then deposited with a trust company. At the least, the promoters committed themselves to a rigorous set of rules on the kinds of securities to be purchased and the way they were to be held and managed. But as the 20s wore along, such niceties disappeared. The investment trust became, in fact, an investment corporation. It sold its securities to the public, sometimes just common stock, more often common and preferred stock, debenture and mortgage bonds, and the proceeds were then invested as the management saw fit. Any possible tendency of the common stockholder to interfere with the management was prevented by selling him non-voting stock, or having him assign his voting rights to a management-controlled voting trust. For a long time, the New York Stock Exchange looked with suspicion on the investment trusts. Only in 1929 was listing permitted. Even then, the Committee on the Stock List required an investment trust to post with the exchange the book and market value of the securities held at the time of listing, and once a year thereafter to provide an inventory of its holdings. This provision confined the listing of most of the investment trusts to the Curb, Boston, Chicago, or other road company exchanges. Apart from its convenience, this refusal to disclose holdings was thought to be a sensible precaution. Confidence in the investment judgment of the managers of the trusts was very high. To reveal the stocks they were selecting might, it was said, set off a dangerous boom in the securities they favored. Historians have told with wonder of one of the promotions at the time of the South Sea Bubble. It was, "For an undertaking which shall in due time be revealed." The stock is said to have sold exceedingly well. As promotions, the investment trusts were, on the record, more wonderful. They were undertakings, the nature of which was never to be revealed, and their stock also sold exceedingly well. 3. During 1928, an estimated 186 investment trusts were organized. By the early months of 1929, they were being promoted at the rate of approximately one each business day, and a total of 265 made their appearance during the course of the year. In 1927, the trusts sold to the public about $400 million worth of securities. In 1929, they marketed an estimated $3 billion worth. This was at least a third of all the new capital issues in that year. By the autumn of 1929, the total assets of the investment trusts were estimated to exceed $8 billion. They had increased approximately 11-fold since the beginning of 1927. The parthenogenesis of an investment trust differed from that of an ordinary corporation. In nearly all cases, it was sponsored by another company. And by 1929, a surprising number of different kinds of concerns were bringing the trusts into being. Investment banking houses, commercial banks, brokerage firms, securities dealers, and, most important, other investment trusts were busy giving birth to new trusts. The sponsors ranged in dignity from the House of Morgan, sponsor of the United and Allegheny Corporations, down to one Chauncey D. Parker. the head of a fiscally perilous investment banking firm in Boston, who organized 3 investment trusts in 1929 and sold $25 million worth of securities to an eager public. Chauncey then lost most of the proceeds and lapsed into bankruptcy. Sponsorship of a trust was not without its rewards. The sponsoring firm normally executed a management contract with its offspring. Under the usual terms, the sponsor ran the investment trust, invested its funds, and received a fee based on a percentage of capital or earnings. Were the sponsor a stock exchange firm, it also received commissions on the purchase and sale of securities for its trust. Many of the sponsors were investment banking firms, which meant, in effect, that the firm was manufacturing securities it could then bring to market. This was an excellent way of ensuring an adequate supply of business. The enthusiasm with which the public sought to buy investment trust securities brought the greatest rewards of all. Almost invariably, people were willing to pay a sizable premium over the offering price. The sponsoring firm, or its promoters, received allotments of stock or warrants which entitled them to stock at the offering price. These they were then able to sell at once at a profit. Thus, one of the enterprises of the Mr. Chauncey D. Parker just mentioned, a company with the resounding name of Seaboard Utilities Shares Corporation, issued 1,600,000 shares of common stock, on which the company netted $10.32 a share. That, however, was not the price paid by the public. It was the price at which the stock was issued to Parker and his colleagues. They, in turn, sold their shares to the public at from $11 to $18.25, and split the profit with the dealers who marketed the securities. Operations of this sort were not confined to the lowly or the vaguely disreputable. J.P. Morgan & Company, which, with Bondbright & Company, sponsored United Corporation in January 1929, offered a package of 1 share of common stock and 1 of preferred to a list of friends, Morgan partners included, at $75. This was a bargain. When trading in United Corporation began a week later, the price was 92 bid, 94 asked on the over-the-counter market. And after 4 days, the stock reached 99. Stock that had been taken up at 75 could be, and was promptly resold at these prices. That such agreeable incentives greatly stimulated the organization of new investment trusts is hardly surprising. 4. There were some, indeed, who only regretted that everyone could not participate in the gains from these new engines of financial progress. One of those who had benefited from the United Corporation promotion just mentioned was John J. Raskob. As chairman of the Democratic National Committee, he was also politically committed to a firm friendship for the people. He believed that everyone should be in on the kind of opportunities he himself enjoyed. One of the fruits of this generous impulse during the year was an article in the Ladies' Home Journal with the attractive title, "Everybody Ought to Be Rich." In it, Mr. Raskob pointed out that anyone who saved $15 a month, invested it in sound common stocks, and spent no dividends would be worth, as it then appeared, some $80,000 after 20 years. Obviously, at this rate, a great many people could be rich. But there was the 20-year delay. 20 years seemed a long time to get rich, especially in 1929. And for a Democrat and friend of the people to commit himself to such gradualism was to risk being thought a reactionary. Mr. Raskob, therefore, had a further suggestion. He proposed an investment trust which would be specifically designed to allow the poor man to increase his capital, just as the rich man was doing. The plan, which Mr. Raskob released to the public in the early summer of 1929, was worked out in some detail. The author stated that he had discussed it with financiers, economists, theorists, professors, bankers, labor leaders, industrial leaders, and many men of no prominence who have ideas. A company would be organized to buy stocks. The proletarian with, say, $200 would turn over his pittance to the company, which would then buy stocks in the rather less meager amount of $500. The additional $300 the company would get from a financial subsidiary organized for the purpose, and with which it would post all of the stock as collateral. The incipient capitalist would pay off his debt at the rate of perhaps $25 a month. He would, of course, get the full benefit of the increase in the value of the stock. And this was something that Mr. Raskob regarded as inevitable. Hammering home the inadequacy of existing arrangements, Mr. Raskob said, "Now all the man with $200 to $500 to invest can do today is buy Liberty bonds." The reaction to the Raskob plan was comparable to the response to a new and daring formulation of the relation of mass to energy. A practical utopia, one paper called it. Another described it as the greatest vision of Wall Street's greatest mind. A tired and cynical commentator was moved to say that it looks more like financial statesmanship than anything that has come out of Wall Street in many a weary moon. Had there been a little more time, it seems certain that something would have been made of Mr. Raskob's plan. People were full of enthusiasm for the wisdom and perspicacity of such men. This was admirably indicated by the willingness of people to pay for the genius of the professional financier. 5. The measure of this respect for financial genius was the relation of the market value of the outstanding securities of the investment trusts to the value of the securities it owned. Normally, the securities of the trust were worth considerably more than the property it owned. Sometimes they were worth twice as much. There should be no ambiguity on this point. The only property of the investment trust was the common and preferred stocks and debentures, mortgages, bonds, and cash that it owned. Often it had neither office nor office furniture. The sponsoring firm ran the investment trust out of its own quarters. Yet, had these securities all been sold on the market, the proceeds would invariably have been less, and often much less, than the current value of the outstanding securities of the investment company. The latter, obviously, had some claim to value which went well beyond the assets behind them. That premium was, in effect, the value an admiring community placed on professional financial knowledge, skill, and manipulative ability. To value a portfolio of stocks at the market was to regard it only as inert property. But as the property of an investment trust, it was much more, for the portfolio was then combined with the precious ingredient of financial genius. Such special ability could invoke a whole strategy for increasing the value of securities. It could join in pools and syndicates to put up values. It knew when others were doing likewise and could go along. Above all, the financial genius was in on things. It had access to what Mr. Lawrence of Princeton described as the stage whereon is focused the world's most intelligent and best informed judgment of the values of the enterprises which serve men's needs. One might make money investing directly in Radio, J.I. Case, or Montgomery Ward, but how much safer and wiser to let it be accomplished by the men of peculiar knowledge and wisdom. By 1929, the investment trusts were aware of their reputation for omniscience, as well as its importance, and they lost no opportunity to enlarge it. To have a private economist was one possibility, and as the months passed, a considerable competition developed for those men of adequate reputation and susceptibility. It was a golden age for professors. The American Founders Group, an awe-inspiring family of investment trusts, had as a director Professor Edwin W. Kemmerer, the famous Princeton money expert. The staff economist was Dr. Rufus Tucker, also a well-known figure. That economists were not yet functioning with perfect foresight is perhaps suggested by the subsequent history of the enterprise. United Founders, the largest company in the group, suffered a net contraction in its assets of $301,385,504 by the end of 1935, and its stock dropped from a high of over $75 a share in 1929 to a little under 75 cents. Still another great combine was advised by Dr. David Friday, who had come to Wall Street from the University of Michigan. Friday's reputation for both insight and foresight was breathtaking. A Michigan trust had 3 college professors, Irving Fisher of Yale, Joseph S. Davis of Stanford, and Edmund E. Day, then of Michigan, to advise on its policies. The company stressed not only the diversity of its portfolio, but also of its counsel. It was fully protected from any parochial Yale, Stanford, or Michigan view of the market. Other trusts urged the excellence of their genius in other terms. Thus, one observed that, since it owned stocks in 120 corporations, it benefited from the combined efficiency of their presidents, officers, and the boards of directors. It noted further that closely allied to these corporations are the great banking institutions. Then, in something of a logical broad jump, it concluded, the trust, therefore, mobilizes to a large extent the successful business intellect of the country. Another concern, less skilled in logical method, contented itself with pointing out that investing is a science instead of a one-man job. As 1929 wore along, it was plain that more and more of the new investors in the market were relying on the intellect and the science of the trusts. This meant, of course, that they still had the formidable problem of deciding between the good and the bad trusts. That there were some bad ones was, though barely, recognized. Writing in the March 1929 issue of The Atlantic Monthly, Paul C. Cabot stated that dishonesty, inattention, inability, and greed were among the common shortcomings of the new industry. These were impressive disadvantages, and as an organizer and officer of a promising investment trust, the State Street Investment Corporation, Mr. Cabot presumably spoke with some authority. However, audience response to such warnings in 1929 was very poor, and the warnings were very infrequent. 6. Knowledge, manipulative skill, or financial genius were not the only magic of the investment trust. There was also leverage. By the summer of 1929, one no longer spoke of investment trusts as such. One referred to high leverage trusts, low leverage trusts, or trusts without any leverage at all. The principle of leverage is the same for an investment trust as in the game of crack the whip. By the application of well-known physical laws, a modest movement near the point of origin is translated into a major jolt on the extreme periphery. In an investment trust, leverage was achieved by issuing bonds, preferred stock, as well as common stock, to purchase, more or less exclusively, a portfolio of common stocks. When the common stock so purchased rose in value, a tendency which was always assumed, the value of the bonds and preferred stock of the trust was largely unaffected. These securities had a fixed value derived from a specified return. Most or all of the gain from rising portfolio values was concentrated on the common stock of the investment trust, which, as a result, rose marvelously. Consider, by way of illustration, the case of an investment trust organized in early 1929 with a capital of $150 million, a plausible size by then. Let it be assumed further that a third of the capital was realized from the sale of bonds, a third from preferred stock, and the rest from the sale of common stock. If this $150 million were invested, and if the securities so purchased showed a normal appreciation, the portfolio value would have increased by midsummer by about 50%. The assets would be worth $225 million. The bonds and preferred stock would still be worth only $100 million. Their earnings would not have increased, and they could claim no greater share of the assets in the hypothetical event of a liquidation of the company. The remaining $125 million, therefore, would underlie the value of the common stock of the trust. The latter, in other words, would have increased in asset value from $50 million to $125 million, or by 150%, and as the result of an increase of only 50% in the value of the assets of the trust as a whole. This was the magic of leverage, but this was not all of it. Were the common stock of the trust, which had so miraculously increased in value, held by still another trust with similar leverage, the common stock of that trust would get an increase of between 700 and 800% from the original 50% advance, and so forth. In 1929, the discovery of the wonders of the geometric series struck Wall Street with a force comparable to the invention of the wheel. There was a rush to sponsor investment trusts which would sponsor investment trusts, which would, in turn, sponsor investment trusts. The miracle of leverage, moreover, made this a relatively costless operation to the ultimate man behind all of the trusts. Having launched one trust and retained a share of the common stock, the capital gains from leverage made it relatively easy to swing a second and larger one, which enhanced the gains and made possible a third and still bigger trust. Thus, Harrison Williams, one of the more ardent exponents of leverage, was thought by the Securities and Exchange Commission to have substantial influence over a combined investment trust and holding company system with a market value in 1929 at close to $1 billion. This had been built on his original control of a smallish concern, the Central States Electric Corporation, which was worth only some $6 million in 1921. Leverage was also a prime factor in the remarkable growth of the American Founders Group. The original member of this notable family of investment trusts was launched in 1921. The original promoter was, unhappily, unable to get the enterprise off the ground because he was in bankruptcy. However, the following year, a friend contributed $500, with which modest capital a second trust was launched, and the two companies began business. The public reception was highly favorable, and by 1927, the two original companies and a third, which had subsequently been added, had sold between $70 and $80 million worth of securities to the public. But this was only the beginning. In 1928 and 1929, an explosion of activity struck the Founders Group. Stock was sold to the public at a furious rate. New firms with new names were organized to sell still more stock, until, by the end of 1929, there were 13 companies in the group. At that time, the largest company, the United Founders Corporation, had total resources of $686,165,000. The group as a whole had resources with a market value of more than $1 billion, which may well have been the largest volume of assets ever controlled by an original outlay of $500. Of the $1 billion, some $320 million was represented by intercompany holdings, the investment of one or another company of the group in the securities of yet others. This fiscal incest was the instrument through which control was maintained and leverage enjoyed. Thanks to this long chain of holdings by one company in another, the increases in values in 1928 and 1929 were effectively concentrated in the value of the common stock of the original companies. Leverage, it was later to develop, works both ways. Not all of the securities held by the founders were of a kind calculated to rise indefinitely, much less to resist depression. Some years later, the portfolio was found to have contained 5,000 shares of Kruger & Toll, 20,000 shares of Colo Products Corporation, an adventuresome new company which was to make soap out of banana oil, and $295,000 in the bonds of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. As Kruger & Toll moved down to its ultimate value of nothing, leverage was also at work. Geometric series are equally dramatic in reverse. But this aspect of the mathematics of leverage was still unrevealed in early 1929, and notice must first be taken of the most dramatic of all the investment company promotions of that remarkable year, those of Goldman Sachs. 7. Goldman Sachs & Company, an investment banking and brokerage partnership, came rather late to the investment trust business. Not until December 4, 1928, less than a year before the stock market crash, did it sponsor the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, its initial venture in the field. However, rarely, if ever in history, has an enterprise grown as the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation and its offspring grew in the months ahead. The initial issue of stock in the Trading Corporation was 1 million shares, all of which was bought by Goldman Sachs & Company at $100 a share for a total of $100 million. 90% was then sold to the public at $104. There were no bonds and no preferred stocks. Leverage had not yet been discovered by Goldman Sachs & Company. Control of the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation remained with Goldman Sachs & Company by virtue of a management contract and the presence of the partners of the company on the board of the trading corporation. In the 2 months after its formation, the new company sold some more stock to the public, and on February 21st, it merged with another investment trust, the Financial and Industrial Securities Corporation. The assets of the resulting company were valued at $235 million, reflecting a gain of well over 100% in under 3 months. By February 2nd, roughly 3 weeks before the merger, the stock for which the original investors had paid $104 was selling for $136.50. 5 days later, on February 7th, it reached $222.50. At this latter figure, it had a value approximately twice that of the current total worth of the securities, cash, and other assets owned by the trading corporation. This remarkable premium was not the undiluted result of public enthusiasm for the financial genius of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs had considerable enthusiasm for itself, and the trading corporation was buying heavily of its own securities. By March 14th, it had bought 560,724 shares of its own stock for a total outlay of $57,021,936. This, in turn, had boomed their value. However, perhaps foreseeing the exiguous character of an investment company, which had its investments all in its own common stock, the trading corporation stopped buying itself in March. Then it resold part of the stock to William Crapo Durant, who resold it to the public as opportunity allowed. The spring and early summer were relatively quiet for Goldman Sachs, but it was a period of preparation. By July 26th, it was ready. On that date, the trading corporation, jointly with Harrison Williams, launched the Shenandoah Corporation, the first of 2 remarkable trusts. The initial securities issue by Shenandoah was $102,500,000. There was also an additional issue a couple of months later, and it was reported to have been oversubscribed some 7-fold. There were both preferred and common stock, for by now Goldman Sachs knew the advantages of leverage. Of the 5 million shares of common stock in the initial offering, 2 million were taken by the trading corporation and 2 million by Central States Electric Corporation on behalf of the co-sponsor, Harrison Williams. Williams was a member of the small board along with partners in Goldman Sachs. Another board member was a prominent New York attorney, whose lack of discrimination in this instance may perhaps be attributed to youthful optimism. It was Mr. John Foster Dulles. The stock of Shenandoah was issued at $17.50. There was brisk trading on a when-issued basis. It opened at 30, reached a high of 36, and closed at 36, or 18.5 above the issue price. By the end of the year, the price was 8 and a fraction. It later touched 50 cents. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs was already preparing its second tribute to the countryside of Thomas Jefferson, the prophet of small and simple enterprises. This was the even mightier Blue Ridge Corporation, which made its appearance on August 20th. Blue Ridge had a capital of $142 million, and nothing about it was more remarkable than the fact that it was sponsored by Shenandoah, its precursor by precisely 25 days. Blue Ridge had the same board of directors as Shenandoah, including the still optimistic Mr. Dulles, and, of its 7,250,000 shares of common stock, there was also a substantial issue of preferred. Shenandoah subscribed a total of 6,250,000. Goldman Sachs, by now, was applying leverage with a vengeance. An interesting feature of Blue Ridge was the opportunity it offered the investor to divest himself of routine securities in direct exchange for the preferred and common stock of the new corporation. A holder of American Telephone and Telegraph Company could receive 4 7/715 shares each of Blue Ridge Preference and Common for each share of telephone stock turned in. The same privilege was extended to holders of Allied Chemical and Dye, Santa Fe, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and some 15 other stocks. There was much interest in this offer. August 20th, the birthday of Blue Ridge, was a Tuesday, but there was more work to be done by Goldman Sachs that week. On Thursday, the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation announced the acquisition of the Pacific American Associates, a West Coast investment trust which, in turn, had recently bought a number of smaller investment trusts, and which owned the American Trust Company, a large commercial bank with numerous branches throughout California. Pacific American had a capital of around $100 million. In preparation for the merger, the trading corporation had issued another $71,400,000 in stock, which it had exchanged for capital stock of the American company, the holding company which owned over 99% of the common stock of the American Trust Company. Having issued more than $250 million worth of securities in less than a month, an operation that would not then have been unimpressive for the United States Treasury, activity at Goldman Sachs subsided somewhat. Its members had not been the only busy people during this time. It was a poor day in August and September of that year when no new trust was announced or no large new issue of securities was offered by an old one. Thus, on August 1st, the papers announced the formation of Anglo-American Shares, Inc., a company which, with a soigné touch not often seen in a Delaware corporation, had among its directors the Marquis of Carisbrooke, GCB GCVO, and Colonel, the Master of Simple, AFC, otherwise identified as the President of the Royal Aeronautical Society, London. American Insurance Stocks Corporation was launched the same day, though boasting no more glamorous a director than William Gibbs McAdoo. On succeeding days came Good Windmill Trading Corporation, National Republic Investment Trust, Insul Utility Investments, Inc., International Carriers Limited, Tri-Continental Allied Corporation, and Solvay American Investment Corporation. On August 13th, the papers also announced that an assistant U.S. attorney had visited the offices of the Cosmopolitan Fiscal Corporation and also an investment service called the Financial Counselor. In both cases, the principals were absent. The offices of the Financial Counselor were equipped with a peephole, like a speakeasy. More investment trust securities were offered in September of 1929 even than in August. The total was above $600 million. However, the nearly simultaneous promotion of Shenandoah and Blue Ridge was to stand as the pinnacle of new era finance. It is difficult not to marvel at the imagination which was implicit in this gargantuan insanity. If there must be madness, something may be said for having it on a heroic scale. Years later, on a gray dawn in Washington, the following colloquy occurred before a committee of the United States Senate. Senator Cozzens, did Goldman Sachs & Company organize the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation? Mr. Sachs, yes, sir. Senator Cozzens, and it sold its stock to the public? Mr. Sachs, a portion of it. The firm invested originally in 10% of the entire issue for the sum of $10 million. Senator Cozzens, and the other 90% was sold to the public? Mr. Sachs, yes, sir. Senator Cozzens, at what price? Mr. Sachs, at $104. That is the old stock. The stock was split 2 for 1. Senator Cozzens, and what is the price of the stock now? Mr. Sachs, approximately 1 3/4. Chapter 4. The Twilight of Illusion. There was no summer lull in Wall Street that year. Along with the great investment trust promotions went the greatest market ever. Every day, prices rose. They almost never fell. During June, the Times Industrials went up 52 points. In July, they gained another 25. This was a total gain of 77 points in 2 months. In all of the remarkable year of 1928, they had gone up only 86.5 points. Then in August, they rose another 33 points. This gain of 110 points in 3 months, from 339 on the last day of May to 449 on the last day of August, meant that during the summer, values had increased overall by nearly a quarter. Individual issues had also done very well. During the 3 summer months, Westinghouse went from 151 to 286 for a net gain of 135. General Electric was up from 268 to 391, and steel from 165 to 258. Even so somber a security as American Tel had gone from 209 to 303. The investment trusts were making good gains. United Founders went from 36 bid to 68. Allegheny Corporation rose from 33 to 56. The volume of trading was also consistently heavy. On the New York Stock Exchange, it was frequently between 4 and 5 million shares. Only occasionally on a full day did it drop below 3 million. However, trading on the New York Stock Exchange was no longer a good index of the total interest in securities speculation. Many new and exciting issues, Shenandoah, Blue Ridge, Penrode, Insull Utilities, were not listed on the big board. The New York Stock Exchange in those days was not a snobbish, prying, or an intolerant institution. Most companies that so desired could have their stocks listed. Nevertheless, there were some who found it wise, and many more who found it convenient, not to answer the fairly elementary requests which were made by the exchange for information. The new stocks, accordingly, were traded on the curb, or in Boston, or on other out-of-town exchanges. Although business on the New York Stock Exchange remained larger than that on all other markets combined, its relative position suffered. In 1929, it had an estimated 61% of all transactions. 3 years later, when most of the new trusts had disappeared forever, the exchange had 76% of the total business. It follows that by the summer of 1929, the normally somnambulant markets of Boston, San Francisco, and even of Cincinnati were having a boom. Instead of being merely a pale reflection of the real thing on Wall Street, they had a life and personality of their own. Stocks were for sale here that couldn't be had in New York, and some of them had an exceptional speculative kick. By 1929, it was a poor town, sadly devoid of civic spirit, which wasn't wondering if it too shouldn't have a stock market. More than the prices of common stocks were rising, so at an appalling rate was the volume of speculation. Brokers' loans during the summer increased at a rate of about $400 million a month. By the end of the summer, the total exceeded $7 billion. Of that, more than half was being supplied by corporations and individuals, at home and abroad, who were taking advantage of the excellent rate of return which New York was providing on money. Only rarely did the rate on call loans during that summer get as low as 6%. The normal range was 7 to 12. On one occasion, the rate touched 15. Since, as earlier observed, these loans provided all but total safety, liquidity, and ease of administration, the interest would not have seemed unattractive to a usurious moneylender in Bombay. To a few alarmed observers, it seemed as though Wall Street were by way of devouring all the money of the entire world. However, in accordance with the cultural practice, as the summer passed, the sound and responsible spokesman decried not the increase in brokers' loans, but those who insisted on attaching significance to this trend. There was a sharp criticism of the prophets of doom. 2. There were two sources of intelligence on brokers' loans. One was the monthly tabulation of the New York Stock Exchange, which, in general, is used here. The other was the slightly less complete return of the Federal Reserve System, which was published weekly. Each Friday, this report showed a large increase in loans. Each Friday, it was firmly stated that it didn't mean a thing, and anyone who suggested otherwise was administered a stern rebuke. It seems probable that only a minority of the people in the market related the volume of the broker's loans to the volume of purchases on margin, and thence to the amount of speculation. Accordingly, an expression of concern over these loans was easily attacked as a gratuitous effort to undermine confidence. Thus, in Barron's on July 8th, Sheldon Sinclair Wells explained that those who worried about brokers' loans and about the influx of funds from corporations simply did not know what was going on. The call market had become a great new investment outlet for corporate reserves, he argued. The critics did not appreciate this change. Chairman Mitchell of the National City Bank, by nature an equable man, was repeatedly angered by the attention being given to brokers' loans and expressed himself strongly. The financial press was also disturbed. And when Arthur Brisbane, later in the year, questioned the propriety of a 10% call rate, the Wall Street Journal reached the end of its patience. Even in general newspapers, some accurate knowledge is required for discussing most things. Why is it that any ignoramus can talk about Wall Street? It does seem possible that Brisbane thought the rate was 10% a day rather than a year. Scholars also reacted against those who, deliberately or otherwise, were sabotaging prosperity with their unguarded pessimism. After soberly viewing the situation, Professor Dice concluded that the high level of brokers' loans should not be as greatly feared as some would have us believe. In August